It's me again. Hope you had a nice weekend and were able to enjoy the sunshine and nature a little bit rather than spending all your time glued to the computer screen like you are now. What I want to do in today's video is get back to types of questions that you might be asked in the Abitur. So if you remember in the very first video last week, we discussed comment questions. And today I'd like to talk about questions where you're asked to discuss something. Typically, that will be a quotation. So first thing is, where will you find this type of question in the Abitur? So if you remember, part 1 is the reading comprehension, part 2 is analysis or mediation, part 3 is composition, and it's in part 3 where you'll find questions where you're asked to discuss something. So what I'd like to do is to use the question from our last Klausur as an example for a discuss question. So let me just read that to you. If you remember, it's about Greta Thunberg, and the task says, in a newspaper article, she argues that learning facts is pointless when the most important facts given by the finest scientists are ignored by our politicians. Discuss the validity of her argument. So, of course, the first thing you're going to do there is write a nice introduction in which you say what the quotation is fundamentally about, in a nutshell, where the quotation is from, when it was published, the usual things. And then the next thing you're going to do is to interpret the quotation. And it's important to remember, when you get a quotation in an exam like that, it's not going to be a simple quotation that says basically just one thing. There are going to be different aspects to it. And if we look at this quotation in a bit more detail, we'll see that there are two main aspects that you have to deal with. Let me point them out to you. So the first one would be when she says, when the most important facts given by the finest scientists are ignored by our politicians. That's her first claim. Politicians are ignoring what qualified scientists are saying. And her second claim, or her second point, is when she argues that learning facts is pointless. So there's no point in learning facts because politicians are ignoring what the scientists say. And you need to set down both sides of that in your interpretation before you start discussing it. And this discussion is where we have the major difference to the comment questions we talked about last week. Because when you're discussing something, that means you really have to deal with both sides of the argument. So whereas in a comment question, you can deal with both sides of the argument, but it's also okay to stick more or less to the side of the argument that you're in agreement with. When you've got a question that says discuss, you really have to deal with both sides of it, regardless of which side you agree. So how is that going to look in practice? Well, you're going to have to deal with, first of all, with this idea that politicians are ignoring what the scientists say. And of course, you can agree with that. You can say that the politicians are being given these facts and everyone knows they're true, and the politicians are still ignoring them for whatever reasons. Maybe they're just bad people, or they're under pressure from various lobbies and things like that. But of course, you also need to give arguments for why that wouldn't be true. You can say, yes, the politicians are doing their best to listen to what the scientists say. They've actually taken a lot of measures, tried to change things for the better in the last few years. So what she's saying isn't simply true. And then you're going to do the same thing for the other claim. Is it the case that even if politicians are ignoring what scientists say, that we should stop learning facts at school? Again, I suppose you could agree with Greta. You could say, well, what's the point? Why bother at all if we're going to be ignored anyway? But here too, you can present the other side of things. Isn't it, if we assume that politicians are ignoring the facts, isn't it even more important that we as individuals should take personal responsibility for getting to know those facts so that we can act for ourselves and maybe personally try to do something to change society? So again, with both these aspects of the quote, you're going to need to present arguments that support it, but that also go against it. That's what discussing is. When you've done that, then you can get to your conclusion. And the conclusion is the part of the argument where, or the part of your answer where you can say what you really think. So you've presented both sides of the question and in the conclusion you say, yeah, but this is my personal view of the matter, and I think this because I find the following arguments the most convincing. So let me sum up. If we take discuss questions as a whole, you'll see that your approach is basically going to be very similar to the approach you take when you're commenting on a quotation or something like that. But the emphasis in this case with discuss has to be on presenting both sides of the argument in a way that you don't necessarily have to do when you're dealing with a comment question. Okay, that's it from me for today. Have a lovely afternoon. The sun is shining outside. Maybe you can take advantage of it. See you soon. Bye.